Okay, so let's take a minute and talk about what you guys have got. Who's willing to share what they composed here?
I'll go even though mine sucks.
I feel that.
Yeah, well, you were only given 20 minutes to do it, right? So, we'll.
And that's also working for other people.
Yeah.
Okay, so 4. I'll clarify my position. I view this as like a conversation.
Okay. So you can go ahead and pull your mask on so we can hear you,
Okay.
since we are outside.
What's puzzling you? There's something wrong. This isn't what you're used to. What a piece of work man is. Because what you see you might not get. Your circuit's dead, he broke off protesting. I'd rather slave on earth for another man, you can bet. Come away, O human child. I believe the greatest teacher failure is. Man delights me not. So basically it's conversation between someone who's human and someone who isn't human about humanity and how interesting they are.
Okay.
So yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And, the weird thing is, it's like even though you're taking fragments and assembling together, like it made sense, right? Like I could follow what was going on here. So yeah, good effort. Who wants to go next?
Here.
Yeah, go ahead.
Don't go chasing waterfalls. One ring to bring them on. Please stick to the rivers and the lakes that you've been used to. I know that you're going to have it your way or nothing at all. Come away, O human child, to the waters and the Rhine. I'm trying to tell you now, it's sabotage. Because what you see is what you might not get. And then, but I think you're moving too fast. For the world is more weak than you.
So one, I noticed Jamal, what you did was like you just used individual lines, right? Like you didn't repeat anything, but you kind of interposed some of these verses into each other. Right? So you took that verse from Waterfalls, right, and you stuck things in between the lines, and you had a kind of refrain effect going there as well. Yeah, good. Hannah, go ahead.
In the darkness, don't go chasing waterfalls. I know that you're gonna have it your way or nothing at all. To the waters and to the wells. What you see, you might not see. You're steaming on a thing that's a mirage. I'm trying to tell you now, it's sabotage. Hope he gets my name, it's the nature of my game. How noble and reason, the beauty of the world. No winning words about me, the greatest teacher failure is.
That's actually a good way to end it, right? That sentence is a kind of good summation. And it's even expressed in kind of poetic diction, right? I mean, yeah, it's Yoda speak. It's Yoda's weird syntax, right? But yeah, and I think you're
like saying, hope he gets my name, it is the nature of my game, and his name is failure.
Pardon?
About, like, his name is failure, like,
yeah.
Guess my name, and like, guess my game, and saying like it's a sabotage and it's a mirage.
Yeah, that's good. That's smart. Yeah, I like that. All right, Nick, what have you got?
Ground control the major plan. What is puzzling? The greatest teacher failure is. Can you hear me, Major Tom? They had better do it to decrease the surplus population.
Huh. I like the way you kind of like address this to like an auditor who isn't listening, right? Hey, pay attention, listen up, right? So these were actually really good, guys. Like this was a solid set of efforts. So do you understand why I wanted you to do this?
On the common thing.
Pardon? Oh, crap. All right. The wind is blowing the wrong way.
Want to use like our book bags to lay it down?
Yeah, that might not be a bad idea. If somebody has something heavy, they can stick in front of it here. Yeah, Jamal, if you can just keep your foot on her stuff.
Please.
Thank you, Hannah. Appreciate it. Down a bit. Okay, I think that might actually work. Excellent, thank you. Okay, so to get back to my question, do we understand why we did this and what this has to do with T.S. Eliot?
To find a common thing.
Okay, so yeah, you're finding a common theme.
Piecing multiple themes to make a story.
Yeah, that's essentially what Eliot's method is in this poem, right? So Eliot works through, at least in this poem, a method called collage. So I know at least one of you is an art major.
That's me.
That's you, yes.
Oh my god. Whoa.
So Jamal, can you tell us anything about what collage is?
So collage, you take various different things and you put it together. You can pretty much use anything. Let's say I want to make a collage out of all these different leaves. Just take leaves and just stick them together to make an image.
Yeah. What you do is, you take existing materials, right? And you cut them up and rearrange them to make them into something new, right? Yeah, that's exactly what's going on here. That is primarily what this poem is. And this line that I've written on the board from near the end of the poem, these fragments I have shored against my ruin, I think is the key to understanding Eliot's artistic method here, right? So let me give you a little bit of background to explain where this is coming out of, right? So Eliot writes this poem in 1921. The world situation in 1921 is a little iffy. What do we know has just ended 3 years earlier?
World War I.
Yes. And then, just as World War I is coming to a close, there's a global flu pandemic as well.
Isn't it like flu and pneumonia?
Pardon?
Isn't it like flu and pneumonia?
Yeah. Yeah, they refer to it as the Spanish flu, though it did not actually originate in Spain. Really what happens, the Spanish government was just less assiduous about covering it up than other world governments were. So it was first publicized there. But yeah, it's spread in large part by soldiers coming home from World War I battlefields. We also have to take into account the amount of devastation that World War I caused across Europe, right? 8 million casualties. 700,000 Britons alone dead. Right? Nearly a whole generation of young British men wiped out. Not to mention the numbers in France, in Belgium, in Germany, and Austria, right? Britain was insulated, being an island, from the direct effects of combat, right? One of the things we talked about was how different things looked on the home front because the battlefield wasn't right outside your window. France, meanwhile, where most of the fighting takes place, much of northern France is turned into wasteland. At least, for several years, right? The landscape is scarred. Now, on top of this, a lot of the guys who are coming home from the war are physically or psychologically maimed. Right? They've either got, these, horrible injuries from mechanized weapons, or they've got permanent lung damage from inhaling poison gases, or more frequently, they have a kind of physically invisible ailment that's referred to at the time as shell shock. Did you run across anything about shell shock in your research, Nick?
It's a little bit like PTSD, right?
Yeah, it's basically it's what they called PTSD before we really knew what that was. So yeah, it's this shell shock is an early name for post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, we know today that PTSD is largely a kind of a physiological response to having witnessed or participated in some immensely stressful traumatic event, right? In the early 20th century, when this was first being diagnosed, it was regarded as a kind of failure of courage, right? That it was a personal failing, a moral failing, rather than a physical ailment. So soldiers who were diagnosed with shell shock were taken away from the front for a little while, told to, buck up, little camper, and then sent right back out into the field. So, many people who were suffering from PTSD were then repeatedly exposed to the same stresses over and over and over again, right? They're given a few weeks of rest, and then they're sent right back out. Wilfred Owen, who you read for last time, was treated in particular for shell shock. He had been trapped at the front for several days with the corpse of another officer. And the experience haunted him for the remainder of his short life. So there's a sense among artists in Europe that European civilization is basically dead and played out, right? It's done. It's over with. There's nowhere we can go from here. So there are kind of two forms this response takes in continental Europe around the same time. Right? The first that I'm going to talk about is called Dada. Have any of you ever heard of Dada before? Not you either, Jamal? Not yet? Okay, so Dada is an art movement that originates in Paris and Zurich during the First World War. Okay. Dada is also it's really influential, but it's also a really short-lived movement, right? It only hangs together for a couple of years. In Zurich, it's primarily built around a group that hangs out at a place called the Cabaret Voltaire. And these artists do things like dress up in a cardboard Pope costume while reciting nonsense poetry to the rhythms of African drumming, while the audience hurls drinks and insults at them. One of the key movers in this group, a guy by the name of Tristan Tzara, wrote a poem that describes the method of writing a Dadaist poem. He says, take a bunch of words from, take a newspaper, cut it up, put a bunch of words in a bag, and pull them out at random. So Dada has Dada is built mostly on kind of pranks, right, and nonsense. One of the most famous Dada pranks is pulled by an artist named Marcel Duchamp. So Duchamp was on the selection jury for an exhibit of modern art in New York City in, I think, 1920, thereabouts. I can't remember the exact year. And one of the submissions to that exhibit was a urinal, just a plain old urinal taken off a wall that someone had signed "R. Mutt." Duchamp wanted to include it in the show because his argument was that art is just a principle, art is based solely on selection, right? Something is art because I decide it is. Something is art because I say it is, right? There's nothing that no object has intrinsic artiness to it. Now, Also happens that Duchamp was Armut, right? He was the guy who had submitted the urinal to try to make this larger point about art and also to screw with the other people on the jury. Because just about everything that the Dadaists did was about screwing with professional bourgeois artists, right? The whole purpose of the movement was to deflate the seriousness and the pretensions of the bourgeois professional artist in a world that no longer seems to make any sense, right? That's why they focus so much on nonsense, right? They're like, look, everything's fallen apart here, right? We just came out of this massive war, this massive flu pandemic. Nobody has any idea what's going on. We have to stop pretending the world actually makes any sense or is organized along any kind of rational principles. Everybody with me? Okay. The second tendency that develops sort of in Paris as Dada is dying out. In fact, a lot of the early Paris Dadaists become influential in this particular movement. This is what they evolve into, is surrealism. Right. In particular, associated with the poet André Breton and the painter Salvador Dali. So, anybody familiar with surrealism? Anybody know what surrealism is or what the surrealists were into? Yeah, go ahead, Jamal.
I mean, like, I can see something saying it's surreal, but I feel like it's kind of like a play on realism, sort of staying away from realism and questioning, is that actually, like, looking at that bush, is that a real bush? Something like that. Like, you warp it in a certain way that makes it no longer seem real.
Yeah. So you juxtapose things that are real together, right? But in ways that wouldn't occur in real life, right?
It's kind
Like,
of like abstract, but more refined.
yeah. And abstract art is just kind of breaking things down into geometric shapes, right? That's basically what you're doing. You're abstracting something into the shapes it's made out of. Surrealism would be more like if that bush, instead of had the regular branches, right? But instead of leaves, it'd be covered like maybe with fingers. Or or if that fire hydrant over there was growing out of the top of it, right? Something like that. So what surrealism is really based on is trying to sort of plumb the depths of the unconscious, right? And in the creation of dream images. Right, the realism in surrealism is the realism of the subconscious, right? What's going on under the surface of our conscious minds, particularly when we're asleep. Because essentially what we do in dreams typically is take things from our everyday experience and mash them up in strange ways, right? People and things that never actually have contact with each other, right? I've had dreams, for example, like where I'm having, a conversation with my father in a house I've never visited, but that is made up of elements of all kinds of different other houses I've visited, right? So surrealism is an attempt to mimic that kind of dream method, that dream logic in art. So I think all of this is influencing what Eliot's doing here, and in particular, the ideas that are at play in this poem, right? So let's start with the title. The wasteland. What is a wasteland?
A land that's no longer useful.
Yeah, exactly. We've seen examples of this kind of throughout the readings we've done here, right? When in Sartor Resartus, right, Carlyle talks about what war has done to this fertile plain, the Marchfeld, in Central Europe, right? we've also seen in the World War I poems these descriptions of no man's land, right, which is itself a deadly wasteland, right? And so what Eliot is doing is connecting these more modern ideas of a wasteland to mythology, in particular to the Grail myth, right? The King Arthur Grail myth. Are any of you familiar with the Grail myth? What do you guys know about the story of the Grail?
Is it like a holy grail?
Pardon?
Is it like a holy grail? Is it like a cup?
Yeah, it's usually described as a cup, right? Although in the earliest stories about it, it's actually a serving platter. It evolves into a cup later. And are any of you familiar at all with the Grail story?
I watched Python.
Okay. Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Okay. That is a version. And it's a very entertaining one. And it is actually, like, in some ways pretty true to medieval tradition, particularly in the way it's kind of woven out of these different stories that sort of come together and sort of don't, and also doesn't really end. But the Grail myth, in its classic form, right, is largely about a knight restoring life to the wasteland, right? So you have this place that's simply called the wasteland that is ruled by a figure who's referred to as the Fisher King. In part because when the knight first encounters him, he finds that he's fishing in a little boat, right? The Christian symbolism of the fish is also probably relevant here. Although the Grail myth in its origins is probably more pagan than Christian. So the Fisher King has been wounded in the thigh. By the Holy Lance, which always accompanies the Grail, right? So the Grail, the cup or the serving platter, is a symbol of feminine sexuality. The lance is a phallic symbol, a symbol of male sexuality, right? So wounded in the thigh is a euphemism, right? Can we guess what it means to have been wounded in the thigh? Pardon? Yeah, it's a euphemism for castration, yeah. And so the king's infertility is connected to the infertility of the land, right? And in order to restore fertility to the land, the knight has to go to a place called the Chapel Perilous, and he has to answer the question, who does the Grail serve? And in so doing, he'll heal the king and restore life to the wasteland, right? Everybody with me? Okay. So this is the basic pattern that Eliot's poem is built on, right? It's deep underneath. It's not always immediately obvious, right? But one thing that we get from early in the poem is that it is very much concerned with ideas of fertility and infertility. Can somebody, by the way, keep an eye on the time?
11:45.
Okay, good. We got plenty of time. Okay, so let's go to the beginning of the poem. Which I know I can find on page 660. Can I get somebody to start reading for us from The Burial of the Dead.
April is the cruelest month breathing. Lilacs out of the dead land makes a memory and desire stir. Dull roots with spring rain. Winter kept us warm, puzzling earth, and forgetful snow, feeding a little life with dried tubers. Summer surprised us coming over the Starnberg disease.
Yep.
With the shower of rain, we stopped in the promenade and went on in sunlight into the Hofgarten and drank coffee and talked for an hour.
Okay, thanks. You can stop there because this actually illustrates two of the major poles of the poem here, right? So, first off, what do we notice about the way the growth of the lilacs is described here?
It's being grown from dead bodies.
Yeah. The lilacs come out of the dead land, right? The title of this section of the poem is The Burial of the Dead. And so when the rains touch the earth, right, the lilacs grow out of the dead land. So we have on the one hand, growth out of burial, right? New life coming out of burial, right? The dried tubers are going to breed new life, right? The other pole we see alluded to in the mention of the Starnberger See, which is a large lake near Munich in Germany. So the reason the Starnberger See is important here, if we read our footnote, is that this is where King Ludwig II of Bavaria drowned. So Ludwig is a 19th century king who is known colloquially in history as Mad Ludwig. Right? Not because he was dangerous or criminally insane, right? I remember there's a ride at Busch Gardens, Williamsburg, where you can find all the rides you love about Europe without any of that annoying culture. It's like the haunted house is like it's haunted by the ghost of Mad Ludwig, right? And he's like this terrifying werewolf spirit that jumps out at you and whatnot. Like nothing to do with the historical Mad Ludwig, right? He was referred to as Mad Ludwig because he was obsessed with building castles. So he built these fairy tale castles all over Bavaria in southern Germany. Have any of you ever been to Disney World? Okay, so what's that?
That was very good.
Yeah, but it's like if you're at least familiar with like the Cinderella's castle, it's right at the center of the Magic Kingdom there. That's based on the design of that is based on one of Ludwig's castles at Neuschwanstein. Now, the reason Ludwig's drowning is important to the poem, though, is that Ludwig was drowned, well, in part, his death was suspicious. It's believed that he was drowned by some of his advisors, in part because he was spending enormous amounts of money on these stupid castles. But also because of his inability to produce an heir to the Bavarian throne. Right, because Ludwig was also gay, right? So the poem associates drowning with homosexuality. And thus with sexual activity that does not produce children, right? And that is one of the big anxieties that we see in Eliot's poem, right? Is what he regards in various ways as misdirections of sexual energy in ways that don't renew the people in the land, right? We see a similar thing in the fire sermon section when there's the sexual encounter between the typist and the young man carbuncular, right? We have a scene that like we might describe as sexual assault occur there, right? But it's all kind of mechanistic and nobody gets any pleasure from it. And you know, it's a dead end, right? It's not going anywhere. And that's one of the things the poem is fixated on, is what Eliot sees as these kinds of sexual dead ends or fertility dead ends, right? And we see this anxiety in the second section of the Barrel of the Dead here. Can I get somebody to start reading from What Are the Roots That Clutch What Branches Grow?
What are the roots that clutch what branches grow out of this stony rubbish? Son of man, you cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images, where the sun beats and the dead trees give no shelter, to the cricket no relief, and the dry stone of sound, no sound of water. Only there is a shadow under this red rock. Come in under the shadow of this red rock, and I will show you something different from either your shadow at the morning striding behind you, or your shadow at the evening rising to meet you. I will show you fear and a handful of dust.
Thank you. So I want to pause on that last line you just read there for a second. I will show you fear and a handful of dust. Right now, when I was in high school and I first read this poem, I had no idea what the hell this line meant, but I wrote it all over my notebooks because it just sounded really metal, right? But it's actually key to what's going on in the poem. Damn it! It's key to what's going on in the poem here, right? I will show you fear in a handful of dust. How might this relate to this fertility and infertility theme that we've been talking about here that pervades the poem?
Dust can't create anything.
I'm sorry, a little louder, Jamal?
Dust can't create anything.
Yeah, dust is infertile soil, right? I will show you fear in a handful of dust, right? I will show you dirt in which nothing grows, right? Earth in which nothing grows. Yeah, usually when I do a class outside, it's in the afternoon when the weather's a little mild. Damn it! Composure. Deep breaths. Pick it up and start over. Okay. Set you there. Lean you back. Okay. Alright, well, we know that this is an experiment we probably won't repeat, right? Thank you to whoever collected my things here as well. Okay, so we're talking about earth in which nothing grows. Now the other thing that I want to note here is this line about a heap of broken images, right? It says, you know only a heap of broken images. So I think what he's talking about here is something similar to what the Dada group was concerned with, right? That all that's left in European art and culture is this collection of fragments that you can then try to construct something new out of, right? This line, these fragments I have shored against my ruin, of self-protection, right? Collage is a kind of defense against kind of personal dissolution, or kind of personal falling apart, right? Good stay. Now, so what was the last thing I said? Collage as a defense against a kind of personal falling apart, right? So the thing that I want to look at, because this explains a lot about modernism in general, is where Eliot thinks this new life is going to come from. If we look towards the end of the poem, the section called What the Thunder Said. Right, where our speaker, or one of our speakers, finds himself in the wasteland. And we have on page 672 The Coming of Rain. Can I get somebody to start reading from Ganja was sunken, and the limp leaves waited for rain.
Ganga was sunken, and the limp leaves waited for rain. While the black clouds gathered from far distant over Himavant, the jungle crouched, humped in silence, and spoke the thunder. Dada. What have we given, my friend? Blood shaking my heart, the awful daring moments surrendered, which an age of prudence can never retract. By this, and this only, we have existed, which is not to be found. Memory is draped by the Memphis spider, or under seals broken by the lean solicitor, in out I have heard the key, turn in the door once and turn once more. We think of the key, each in the prison, thinking of the key, each confirms a prison, only at nightfall. Ethereal rumors revive for a moment, a broken Coriolanus, Damiata. The boat responded gaily to the hand, expert with sail and oar. The sea was calm, the heart would have responded gaily when invited, even obedient to controlling hands. I sat upon the shore, fishing with the arid plain behind me. Shy, at least, set my hands in order.
Okay, so there we're finishing up here with the Fisher King, right? Sitting in his boat, wondering about the future of his kingdom. But what I want to pay particular attention to here is, as I said, what's happening at the beginning of this passage, right? Where are these black rain clouds coming from? These references to Ganga, right? Ganga is the Ganges River. And Himavant refers to the Himalayas. So if there's no hope for renewal in Europe, where does renewal have to come from?
India?
Yeah, exactly. And the material that he's drawing from here, like this kind of path forward that is painted in this passage, these three interpretations of the word Da, comes from a set of early Hindu philosophical texts called the Upanishads, right? So one thing to note about Eliot is that Eliot is very, very highly educated, right? This was a guy who had completed all the requirements for a philosophy PhD at Harvard, but unfortunately never made it back to the United States to defend his dissertation because war broke out and he couldn't get home, right? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, what? Sorry, what the dog means?
That's not what it means. It's the text it comes from is called Upanishads. Upanishads. So Eliot, speaks and reads several languages. He's incredibly well versed in the Western cultural and literary tradition, right? And he is writing for an audience that is also well versed in these traditions, right? Who is going to understand the allusions that he makes. So I'm going to guess that most of you guys had some trouble with the poem, right? That this was not easy to understand. Yeah. And I mean,
what does this word mean, and what does that have to do with the wasteland?
Yeah, what the hell is this quote, right? Yeah, why is there French in here all of a sudden, right?
Why is there French, German?
Yeah, and Eliot is associated with a movement called High Modernism.
His footnotes didn't help at all, by the way.
No, they don't.
Yeah, just like that guy, the question was like, no.
Yeah, especially Eliot's own notes, right? The ones that are listed as Eliot's note, right? Those are especially unhelpful. And they were deliberately unhelpful, right? He put them in because his publisher insisted that he do so. So he said, well, fine, I'll show you. Wrote endnotes to the poem that really didn't help illuminate anything in it, right? But I think, Eliot and other high modernists tend toward intellectual snobbery, and if you told him that you didn't understand the poem, his response would probably be, well, good, you weren't supposed to. But the other thing that the high modernists do, in addition to writing these kinds of polyglot poems that quote liberally from the Western cultural tradition, they're also highly interested in infusing that tradition with new blood from other places, in particular from India and Africa. Now, this is what we would today probably call cultural appropriation, right? Like the white dude with dreads leading a reggae band, right? But this comes in part from a misconception on the part of Europeans that cultures in India and in Africa were primitive, right? Were less advanced, and thus were places they could look to for new energy to cure an over-civilized age, right? You may have noted, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Picasso's paintings, but when he moves into his abstract phase, a lot of the faces in his paintings look like African masks. So that's, one other example of this tendency in modernist art, right? But the last thing I want to hit on here is what the three different interpretations of the word Da are and what they mean and how they relate to Eliot's idea of cultural renewal, right? So, humans, naturally selfish, hear a word that means give. Demons naturally cruel hear a word that means love. And lesser gods, naturally chaotic, word that means control. And the idea of renewal that we're getting here comes from this triad of give, love, control, right? What's missing from most of the sexual encounters that permeate the poem are any sense of any of these things, right? You know, the two women talking about their friend in the bar are behaving selfishly. The encounter between the Tempest and the young man Carbuncular indicates both a lack of love and a lack of control, right? So the basic idea here, right, is that we're turning these principles to sexual relationships, which are coming from this Hindu source, is what is necessary to bring life back to the wasteland, right? To set the lands in order. So does anybody have any questions about this? I think we're about close to time here, and I'm tired of holding the board up.
12:07.
What's that?
12:07.
12. Okay, so yeah, we're close enough, and I think we've got the point here, right? Does the poem make any more sense to you now?
The poem itself, no, but the idea behind it, yes.
Okay, well, I think if you know a little bit more about the idea behind it and you read it again, it will probably make a little more sense to you. At least I hope it will. So I'll let you go. I will email you guys the guide questions and a reminder about, you know, what to read for next time and what's coming due and all that. And I will see you on Monday.
You said no response paper. Do we have a vocab quiz?
There's no vocab quiz. Thank you. All right, I'm just gonna ease this to the ground so I don't really have to worry about it anymore. All right, let's just let it fall. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Aaron.